Good evening and welcome to the Monday, September 28th, 2020 regular meeting of the Littleton Planning Commission. Can we please have the roll call? Colleen?
Chair Rudnicki.
Here.
Vice Chair Swartzbacher.
Here.
Commissioner Almond.
Here.
Commissioner Bolt. Commissioner Coronado.
Here.
Commissioner Miller.
Here.
Commissioner Mirzahi.
Here.
Commissioner Reynolds.
Here.
Commissioner Stallman.
Here.
Okay, Commissioner Bolt is absent, which means Commissioner Almond, that moves you into a voting position.
Well, clarification. If Bolt comes on before the presentation begins, does Sherry step down again or does she stay up?
Reed?
My preference would be that unless someone is here for the entire
Right.
appeal process, then they probably should not be voting.
Yeah, but we have to go through approval of minutes. But it's going to
shows up before we. If he shows up before we start, then he's good. But once we've launched into the appeal, then it would be inappropriate for him to vote on stuff when he's through the entirety of it.
Sherry, I don't want this to happen again where you got up on stage and then we knock you off again, so try to avoid that this time.
At least she doesn't actually have to physically leave the dais this time.
That's right.
That's right.
We do have a quorum.
All right. So I'm going to ask the moderator to review the process for the virtual meeting.
Thank you, Chair. Thank you. Good evening, commissioners, staff, citizens, and guests. I'm Colleen Norton, City Clerk, and I'll be the moderator for this evening's virtual meeting of the Planning Commission. We are streaming this meeting on Cable Channel 8, Facebook, and on our website, littletongov.org. Those wishing to participate in any public comment portion of the meeting are advised to view the meeting on our website, as this broadcast has the least amount of delay. As always, citizen participation is encouraged during public comment. To participate via phone, please call 669-900-6833, and when prompted, enter the webinar ID 923-1980-5373. There will only be one opportunity this evening for public participation during public comment. When public comment is announced, press *9 to raise your hand to be recognized as a speaker. Microphones will be muted for all citizens calling in. Once recognized, speakers will be unmuted and will have 3 minutes to address the Planning Commission. The City Clerk will announce when you have 30 seconds remaining, and again when your time is up. We expect comments to be civil. Disrespectful or disruptive behavior will not be tolerated. For agenda items, the chair will ask for a motion and a second, followed by discussion and a vote. Votes on agenda items will be made using a thumbs up for a yes vote and a thumbs down for a no vote. The clerk will call each vote with all ayes and nays. Again, if you plan on participating during public comment, please call 669-900-6833, and when prompted, enter webinar ID 923-1980-5373. Press *9 to raise your hand to speak. Thank you, Chair.
Okay, thank you, Colleen. Next up is approval of the agenda. You all have the agenda in front of you. Are there any changes? Seeing none, we'll move on. Next is minutes to be approved. This is minutes of our April 27th PC meeting.
Chair of the August 31st meeting.
Oh, excuse me, what I'm saying. Whoa, it's interesting. You have here April 27th. Okay.
August 31st.
Okay.
Sorry.
So much for the script. Okay. For the August meeting, are there any changes, corrections, deletions? Jason.
Yes, one correction in
First Amendment vote tally regarding removing 4 stories in the downtown transition area. The vote tally should be 1-6 rather than 1 in favor, 7 opposed.
Thank you.
Anyone else? Seeing none, I'll entertain a motion.
I move to approve, based on the clerk's certification, the August 31, 2020 minutes of the Littleton Planning Commission with that one adjustment.
As amended.
As amended.
Any seconds?
Second.
Bruce is second. Any discussion? Please vote. Yes is up, thumbs up. No is thumbs down. Make sure your thumb can be seen.
The vote is 7 in favor. The motion carries unanimously.
Okay. Thank you. Okay. Next up is public comment. Colleen, you want to take us through it again?
Absolutely. If you wish to address the Planning Commission under public comment and are not already in the queue to speak, please call 669-900-6833, and when prompted, enter the webinar ID 923-1980-5373. Then press star 9 to raise your hand to be recognized. Citizen microphones will be automatically muted until the citizen is called upon to speak. Citizens will be recognized by the last 3 digits of their phone number. When called on to speak, please remember to state your name and district or address for the record. Public comment is an opportunity to express opinions or ask questions regarding issues that are not part of public hearings on tonight's agenda. Each speaker will be limited to 3 minutes. The city clerk will notify you when you have 30 seconds remaining, and again when your time is up. Chair, we currently have 3 callers in the queue, 1 with their hand raised, caller with the last 3 phone number digits of 319. Please press star 6 to unmute yourself, identify yourself, and begin speaking now. Caller with the last 3 phone number digits of 319.
Okay, this is Marty Bitts at 5513 South Prince Street, District 1. My husband Bob and I have lived in Old Littleton since March 1971 and raised our family here, where Bob could walk to Arapahoe Community College to teach math. When we bought this house, we labored to improve our property by maintaining its Victorian-style appearance while updating its inner technology. In 1992, we joined the Littleton Second Century Fund Group, which worked to preserve the old but friendly and innovative character of our community. One way we contribute to life here is to chat with people walking by on Prince Street and to be supportive of efforts to allow change while preserving character. We believe in the progress of civic life. Just because many variances have been granted in the past to allow buildings to go up which have been outside the guidelines doesn't mean that these errors should be repeated once again. Just because the word facade can mean that part of a building parallel to the street, that word in English means face, and when we greet people, we don't turn our backs to them or even our sides. Just because there is grass across the street from one's new slot home on the west side of Prince Street, that one should take pet dogs over there to relieve themselves twice a day. We have the advantage of an alley to distance us from new development on our west, which mitigates the lost view and sun. And we put in a driveway to relieve parking problems. The historic character of the North Prince Street entrance to Littleton is reduced by each building that is accepted, which varies from the comprehensive plan, which was to fit existing scale, mass, and green space of the historic character of Old Littleton. Approving and comparing a new proposal to cutting-edge modern structures that were first built and occupied within the past couple of years violates the spirit of what the citizens of Littleton have asked for. Thank you.
Thank you. Colleen, other speakers?
Chair, yes, we have 1 other speaker in the queue with their hand raised. Caller with the last 3 phone number digits of 493. If you would like to speak, please press star 6 to unmute. Remember to identify yourself. Please begin speaking.
Good evening, Planning Commission. This is Frank Atwood. I live in District 4. I would like to mention some tangential aesthetics with regards to the 5423 South Prince Street appeal. The Colorado 2020 Official State Vacation Guide touts Littleton downtown as tree-lined. The street was tree-lined until the developer scraped 2 trees. So much for Littleton's vision being consistent with what the State Tourism Office is touting. A second tangential aesthetic is, I suspect the cars on the property will be maneuvering so tightly among the slot homes, I'd be surprised if any of the dandelions in the asphalt will survive. The dandelions will all wish they were on the 4th-story roof rather than trying to survive between the garages. But let's get to something serious. We're here because the Grove slipped through without citizens having a formal method of objection. And now, for a $500 fee, a property owner with standing has exercised her right to object under the new code, thanks to the Grove. I thank the city for the code changes, also the Planning Commission, so that a property owner can appeal an approval of a major site development plan. In number 3 of the developer's response, he says the city will respond on his behalf to asserted code violations. In tonight's view graphs provided by the city that attempts to address this, I see no mention of addressing these code violations. So to me, it appears these code violation issues stand. My understanding is silence gives consent. The city's failure to provide rebuttal implies not just a weak case, but a non-existent case. You, Planning Commission, voted to prohibit slot homes in downtown, and Council ratified that in the April-May 2020 recommendation. Slot homes do not belong in downtown Littleton. This is not just a question of aesthetics. The proposal, in my opinion, is illegal.
30
Additionally,
seconds.
In the city's view graph appeal, point 2, consistency with design standards, subsection, it says 1.14 is met. The assertion is made that the primary facade is parallel to the street. Only 2 out of 6 doors face Prince Street, and that is the primary facade. Front facade is the one with the most front doors, not just parallel to the street. Thank you.
Thank you, Frank. Any other speakers?
Chair, I have no other callers in the queue with their hands raised at this time.
Okay, then we'll close the public comment and go on to tonight's show, which is general business. Appeal 20-001, appeal of major site development plan SDP 19-0008. I'm going to have Reed kind of give us a kind of an overview of the this process that we've never gone through for an appeal to the site development plan. Reed, could you just give us a little overview of when this happened and the purpose behind it?
Yeah, I'll do my best. I would say this appeal process is a little unusual in the sense of how it's set out and allowing for affected property owners to assert their right that the community development director's decision on a major SDP was, flawed in some sense. Essentially, what this is the community development director approved a major site development plan on July 30th of 2020, and it's at the location of 5423 South Prince Street. Our city council adopted a major site development plan kind of appeal process back, I want to say in April or May of 2019. And I believe probably some of the impetus behind the adoption at that time, just kind of getting into the legislative history, had to do with a particular development coming in that was able to be approved administratively. And so there was not that public process, and to a lot of persons' chagrin, may or may not have fit in with the character of our downtown. So I believe that was the basis for trying to come up with a procedure, an appeal procedure, really as more of a fact check, truth test, if you will, of the community development director's decision on these. And that led to both a minor site development plan approval or appeal process, as well as this major site development plan appeal process. A couple of notes that I would make would be that it specifically calls out in this section of the appeal process, this is not quasi-judicial. So I think that's important in the sense that I don't think what it does is open the door to planning commissioners to go seek out the thoughts of other persons as you would in terms of a legislative process when you were looking at doing phase 1 amendments or phase 2 amendments, where it's important to get all sorts of opinions when making those recommendations. That's not the case here. What is meant by the fact that this is not a quasi-judicial process is the fact that it's administrative. When one thinks of quasi-judicial, literally what it means is you're acting as the judge. And what it means is you're taking facts that you hear, and you're applying it to criteria, and you're rendering a decision based upon that. The fact that this specific section calls out that this is not quasi-judicial, that it is in fact an administrative review of the community development director's decision to approve the major SDP, leads to kind of a different set of your review process. You're not going in this with an individual community development director hat on. It's more of the administrative review in the sense that looking to ensure that the decisions that were made checked off all the boxes in terms of the criteria for approving SDPs, whether or not it was consistent or inconsistent with those approval criteria, and whether or not the community development department, I would, obviously Jennifer's the one who signs off on this, but there's planners involved as well, whether they did their due diligence when they went through this process and tried to make sure that it met the various applicable criteria that are set out in the site development plan approval process. So pursuant to our process, those adjacent properties of a development within 700 feet have an opportunity to appeal that decision. And that was done on August 25th. And so the applicant filed an appeal listing forth those sections within the site development plan approval criteria that they did not believe were met. Subsequently, those criteria were expounded upon by the appellant's legal counsel. And so what we'll be doing tonight is the appellant has an opportunity to present before the board, for the commission, those reasons that they don't believe that it met the applicable criteria. Following that, the applicant will have an opportunity to present on their own behalf in terms of how it did, as well as staff. So that's the way that it's going to go, is the appellant will have an opportunity to present. Questions then could be made from individual commissioners in follow-up. The applicant has an opportunity to present as well as questions from the commissioner and staff. And if there's any rebuttal, then the appellant will have an opportunity to rebut those items that came forward either in the applicant's testimony or staff's presentation. But generally nothing new other than kind of responding to what they heard from that. So while this is a public meeting, it's not necessarily a public hearing. So with that said, individual persons, the public at large, does not have an opportunity to comment on this. And this preamble, if you will, where public comment was already given. That was their only opportunity to bring up their thoughts on this particular appeal that's in front of the commission tonight.
Okay.
So hopefully that my rambling, someone was able to glean something meaningful from it, but I will turn it back to you.
Bruce, got a quick question?
Yeah, Reed, I just wanted to stipulate the appellant in this case is within 700 feet of the property and therefore does have standing.
That's correct.
Okay, just wanted to make sure.
Mhm.
Thank you.
Point of clarification, Reed, you said that major site development plans allows for this process. I think you also said minor site development plans can go through this process. Is that correct?
In terms of the minor site development plans, that's really, that's more of the applicant. If they were denied, has the ability to appeal that process. So this one with the major, it affords adjacent property owners within 700 feet the ability to do it. A minor, they would not.
Okay.
Thank you. I apologize.
Okay. And by the way, Planning Commission is the final arbiter of this case. Any other appeals would go to trial. Let's see. We'll go ahead and start with the presentation for the appellant. I'm sorry. Is the appellant available and ready to go?
Yes, good evening. I'm gonna fumble around and share my screen real quick. Okay, can folks see that?
Yes.
All right, great. Thank you all very much. My name is James Silvestro. I'm a land use attorney with the law firm of Ireland, Stapleton, Pryor and Pasco. As was mentioned, I am counsel for the appellant, Pam Chadbourne. Before we jump in, I just want to thank staff for all their help through this process. I know there's a lot of work that goes on behind the scenes. And I especially want to thank all the commissioners. I know there's a lot to read, and we certainly appreciate the time and consideration you put into preparing for this hearing, and then, of course, the opportunity to present tonight. So thank you very much. So as was mentioned, the appellant tonight, my client is Pam Chadbourne. She lives at 5402 South Nevada Street, which is shown in green there on the corner. And as was stipulated, she's within 700 feet of the site for the SDP. Ms. Chadbourne's lived in her home for over 20 years. She's invested significantly, not only in her home, but in her neighborhood. I'm sure many of you have heard from her. She's very active in the community and cares deeply about, what's happening to Littleton and preserving the neighborhood that she loves and helping it to grow in a way that makes sense. So zooming out just slightly on 5423 Prince Street, I'm sure you all are familiar with this. It's very close to the municipal complex, of course, but it's helpful just to set the stage a little bit. As you head south, you run into downtown, obviously. It's just a few blocks west of the municipal complex and across the street from the Geneva Village senior housing community. Of course, those are, a bunch of one-story apartments, lots of trees on that east side of Prince Street. And then to the east of the west of the proposed site over where Ms. Chadbourne lives is what's known as the old downtown Littleton neighborhood. And that's a collection of, a few dozen single family, single story, 1.5 story homes that have been established for years and years. If we look at the SDP that's before you tonight, it's a proposal for 4 stories up to 40 feet, which is allowed under the zoning, to put 6 slot homes on a parcel that was previously occupied by a small 1-story home. I think it was most recently used as a marijuana dispensary. And as was mentioned, I think the trees on the site, unfortunately, have already come down, but it was previously, landscaped with bushes and trees and a lawn, a good setback from the road for that single-story house. And you can see, I tried to make the scale as good as I could. Obviously, it's sort of a rough comparison, but you can see the proposal going from lot line to lot line on the right of this slide, where the whole left side, I guess the south side, looking from Prince Street, would be the driveway. And then the rest of the proposal is literally squeezed in almost every inch of the lot to get those 6 units and to maximize the floor area ratio for each of those 6 units going to the lot line to the north. And this is a small lot. It's only 0.17 acres, I think, even, you know, relative to other downtown lots, without having the alley access down this block, and the fact that it used to be a very modest single-story home. It's a very small lot, and the proposal will again squeeze in those 6 units, and you can see on the overview here, I think this is the ground floor level with the garages. Not even every unit will have a 2-car garage. 3 of the units will have 2-car garages, and 3 of them will be so narrow that they'll actually only fit 1 car. And then the other thing that this overhead shows is, again, that south side of the proposal is all driveway. It's going to be an impervious surface. There won't be any parking there because obviously folks will need to be able to access their garages. And so for these 6 units, 12 or more residents, there's only going to be 9 garage parking spots on the site. Turning to the actual criteria tonight, there are 6 of the 12 criteria that we're going to want to look at. And some of these are more subjective than others. Some of them get more into the aesthetics and the architecture, which I'll address towards the end of the presentation. But I actually want to sort of take these out of order because I think there are 2 criteria that, aren't really a discretionary call. It's not about whether something is good enough or, various shades of gray. They're really black and white issues that make this proposal illegal and therefore require denial without any sort of discretion. And the first issue is the zoning for the site. And then the second issue is the downtown design guidelines, specifically sections 1.12 and 1.14. Again, if the commissioners agree with the appellant that these are sort of black and white violations of the city's rules and regulations, then the only choice here tonight is going to be to deny the SDP. I suppose reverse the staff is the appropriate way to look at it. Before talking about the substance of the zoning violation, I want to address one comment that was made in the staff rebuttal letter. And there's a suggestion that Ms. Chadbourne had waived the issue of zoning because she didn't explicitly call it out in her first letter. And there's a few things for the board to know about that, the commission to know about that. And the first is that when Ms. Chadbourne submitted that initial appeal, she only had 20 days to do it. She did not yet have an opportunity to retain legal counsel. I wasn't representing her at that time. And like a concerned citizen, a layperson, she did the best that she could. But it's really unfair to think that the city would take this 20-day requirement as a hard and fast rule that would ultimately allow an illegal land use to move forward under the zoning code. This process is ongoing. We're here tonight to present you with potentially additional evidence that you haven't seen or heard before. And I think this process is ongoing until you ultimately vote and make a decision on what staff has done here. And perhaps more importantly, aside from the waiver issue, under the comprehensive plan, which is one of the issues that Ms. Chadbourne raised, a land use has to comply with the zoning. Similarly, downtown design guidelines, another issue that Ms. Chadbourne raised, a land use has to comply with the zoning. And then finally, separate from this SDP process, of course, state and municipal law require that land uses comply with the applicable zoning. So I think this is an issue that the board needs to consider. I don't think it's something that can be avoided through procedural issues. Turning to the actual zoning, I think everyone stipulates that the zoning applicable to this proposal is the central area zone as it existed. This is important, we'll get into it in a minute, but as it existed at the time of the submittal, which was August 19th, 2019. And the critical issue is that, with respect to the definition of townhouse, and that's really what we're going to be talking about here, that definition has changed by action of the city council. But at the time that the proposal was submitted, which is the relevant time, section 10-2-18F provided the following for residential only developments in the downtown area. And this is a residential only development that is east of Santa Fe. So this subsection F applies to this proposal. At that time, and still today actually, there's a requirement that for any townhomes within this area, the minimum lot size per residential unit, not per lot, not per subdivision, not per fee simple. The criteria says minimum lot size per residential unit, there must be 2,500 square feet. So for every townhouse in a townhouse development, there must be 2,500 square feet per residential unit. At the time that this proposal was submitted, the definition of townhouse was a single family dwelling unit with a private entrance, which is part of a structure whose dwelling units are attached horizontally in a linear arrangement and having a totally exposed front and rear wall to be used for access, light, and ventilation. The units are separated from one another by a common party wall having no doors, windows, or other provisions for human passage or visibility. So the proposal that we're looking at tonight is a proposal for townhouses under that August 19th, 2019 definition. And within this area, the CA area east of Santa Fe, there's a requirement that you have at least 2,500 square feet for each residential unit. So on a site like this that's 0.17 acres, it's physically impossible to squeeze 6 townhouses onto the site. You would need at least 15,000 square feet. And 0.17 acres is actually less than half of that. It's only about 7,400 square feet. So under the relevant zoning that the city has said applies to this proposal, this doesn't comply with the CA zoning. And the city in the rebuttal has sort of put up 2 arguments, and I'm sure we'll hear about them when the city has a chance to address this. But the first argument is essentially that these are not townhouses. You know, the fact that 5 of these line up perfectly and only have access from the front and back and have no windows on either side, that doesn't make them townhouses because there's one unit that's stuck on the front that faces the street. And then the second unit also has a door that's facing the street. And the argument is that that somehow breaks up the fact that you actually have 6 units stacked horizontally. But again, if you just look at the specifics of what that definition of townhouse is, I think it's very clear that these are townhomes. I'll say even the developer, perhaps unintentionally on the SDP submittal, calls this a 6 townhome project. So I think it's just common sense that these are single family dwellings with private entrances. They're horizontal in linear arrangement. They have totally exposed rear and front, and they share common walls with no doors or windows. A little graphic there. I mean, those are the 5 shared party walls. These are 6 townhouses. The other argument that staff tries to make, and it's at page 8 of the rebuttal report, is that the minimum law requirements for townhomes established under 10-2-18F1 is for townhome developments that opt to subdivide the townhomes for fee simple sales. But again, if we go back to what that definition of townhouse was in August of 2019, there's nothing about fee simple lots or subdivisions or anything like that. It's literally just about single family dwelling units, basically row houses that have common wall agreements. So, where is this idea coming from that you would need to subdivide townhomes for them to be townhomes under this definition? And honestly, I struggled with that for a while. I had to look around and talk with some folks. And what we ultimately came up with is that I think that there's sort of an apples and oranges issue here where staff is looking at changes that have subsequently been made to the zoning code to argue that, well, this has been legalized because in May of 2020, excuse me, that's actually an error on the slide. It should be May 19th, 2020. The city council passed ordinance ordinance 17/2020, and that specifically added the language here that you see here highlighted in blue. And so that was basically taking the old definition of townhome, which we looked at, and it added on this additional requirement to meet the definition of what a townhouse is. And that says, and such units are located on their own fee simple lots, meeting the various law requirements specified in each zone district allowing townhome development. So following May 2020, again, I apologize, there's an error on the slide, May 2020, there's this new requirement for what is, under the definition of townhouse, and that actually requires subdivision. But prior to that, under the zoning that the city itself is trying to apply to this SDP, that subdivision requirement wasn't there. And so you go back to this reality, which is that it's physically impossible under the zoning at the time to squeeze 6 units onto a 7,400 square foot lot. The other thing to recognize about, this legalization, if you will, of non-subdivided townhomes is that prior to making this change and adding in the language about fee simple subdivision, that was actually when the city of Littleton had banned slot homes altogether May 5th, 2020 under resolution number 44-2020. And so the timing here is important because it shows that even if there was a time when maybe this proposal became legal under the new definition of townhome, that actually happened after the prohibition on slot homes was already put into place. And so what you end up with is a situation where this SDP has never complied with any version of the zoning code. It violated it at the time it existed because this lot is too small to accommodate 6 townhouse units. It violated it on May 5th because it's a slot home proposal that's now illegal. And it still violates it today under either of those provisions. We're either applying the zoning that was in place in August 2019, when this was a townhouse that required a 15,000 square foot lot, which we don't have, or you could apply the zoning from May 5th, 2020 moving forward, at which time, this is an illegal slot house. The other sort of insurmountable legal issue for this proposal is the downtown design guidelines, specifically sections 1.1.2 as well as 1.1.4. And 1.1.2 requires street-facing facades to be designed to be the primary facade. The staff actually, I think unintentionally maybe omitted to check met or not applicable here, but this does apply. And then more importantly, down at 1.1.4, the majority of the building's primary facade must be oriented parallel to the street on which it fronts. And the comment here is that only 2 of the 6 entries are actually facing Prince Street. And so if you go back to this overhead, you see that it's not a majority of the primary facade facing Prince Street. What you have is this one little strip of the building, because this is a slot home, that's actually facing Prince Street. And they've sort of manipulated the doors to get 2 of the doors actually facing the street, but it's not possible to get a majority of the primary facade facing Prince Street, at least under this design, and probably, frankly, under any design, given how narrow the site is. I don't know that there's a way to reconfigure this to make it so that a majority of the primary facade actually faces Prince Street. If you look, this would be looking west from Prince Street. This is the building design, again, sort of lot line to lot line. You end up with this narrow tower where you can see 2 of the 6 doors. So again, that's a minority, obviously, of the total amount for the primary facade. And then where you really have the primary facade is when you look at it from the north, and I'm not sure there's a way to do that. I guess you'd be on the neighbor's property. That's when you actually see 4 of the 6 homes. Actually, from this rendering, you can see the awnings for the other 2. So, arguably all 6 of the units actually face north or sort of present themselves to the north. But either way, the point here is that a majority of the primary facade is not facing Prince Street, it's facing north to the adjacent lot line. So those are the 2, what I would call sort of objective, insurmountable legal hurdles. I also do want to touch briefly on some of the more subjective factors. And obviously there's been a lot written about this between the parties and then also city staff coming back. And there's a pretty constant refrain in the city's rebuttal submission, which is that, well, this proposal meets the minimum criteria or it doesn't exceed the maximum criteria. And the response there is that when you look at the approval requirements under 10.7.3c, the job that you all have been tasked with doing tonight, it's not about doing the least amount possible to get something approved. There's a lot of subjectivity injected into this process. And so I think that requires staff and it requires this commission to be a little bit more sensitive to the context and the characteristics, the specifics of every proposal. It's not about, just barely checking the box to make sure you have the right amount of open space or the right amount of parking spaces or what have you. It's to really look at where this proposal is what neighborhood it's in, what's around it, you know, where this neighborhood is coming from, where it's going to. And so that's why these issues really aren't black and white for either side. I don't think. I think it's a subjective decision for this board to consider compliance with the comprehensive plan, compliance with the other elements of the downtown design guidelines, and compliance with the existing architecture and historic character of the neighborhood. So just touching briefly on a few of these, the goal 1 under the 2014 citywide plan calls for housing for every generation and income level. And the city, you know, claims, well, that's aspirational. It doesn't have to be met at every project. And perhaps that's true. But again, I just ask you all to look at the SDP that's in front of you. I mean, what you're going to end up with is 6 very cramped units with 4 levels, so 3 staircases. And, you know, it's going to be a new product, so it's going to be high end, I'm sure. But think about what sort of citizens are going to be able to buy a home that has 3 sets of staircases. It's going to be difficult for anyone with a disability, anyone who's elderly, and obviously, you know, looking forward to their golden years. Even folks with young kids, I think, would probably struggle to lug, you know, a stroller up and down 3 flights of stairs and get kids up and down safely. The other issue under the 2014 citywide plan is what goal 4 refers to a distinctive Littleton, and it talks about these gateway areas into downtown. I'm sure you all have looked at the SDP, and obviously architecture is subjective to an extent, but to me, it just looks like any other, you know, new slot home sort of crammed in there as best they could, but it doesn't really present a distinctive welcome to downtown. There's nothing specific about downtown. And I think most disconcerting is the loss of those established trees and the landscaping, because really, especially when you look at the Geneva complex across the street and the municipal complex, you have an area with water features and lots of trees, and tree canopy is really important, and big lush lawns. And this is really out of context with what's going on over there. Similarly, when you look at the downtown neighborhood plan, it talks about how redevelopment must conform to existing scale, mass, and feel in the neighborhood. We'll talk more about height in a second, but again, given the confines of this very narrow lot, what you end up with is sort of this monolith from the street where it's not very wide. It's going all the way up to the maximum allowable height. And it creates sort of an imposing pedestrian experience. Like I said, we'll look at a rendering in a moment. And then lastly, the redevelopment must be compliant with the historic style and character. And again, I think we heard it in the public comments, but this is really going to sort of be an odd man out given everything that surrounds it. Turning to the design guidelines, and obviously there's a number of these, but I think the most important one to consider tonight is specifically for sub-area 3, which this proposal, Ms. Chadbourne's home, both fall in. There's a suggestion that the river bend sets a desirable precedent for this entry into downtown. And that's what those 2 pictures are. You see sort of the welcome sign when you turn off Santa Fe onto Prince Street to downtown Littleton. Obviously, you know, dozens of trees as you come down Prince Street. And then actually the specifics of the Riverbend development, which is sort of behind the sign there, creates a very walkable pedestrian scale, single story. You see facades and it's sort of inviting to the pedestrian experience. And then you compare that to this SDP, which again has sort of this monolithic squeezed in feel. It's a much different character than the open sort of welcoming environment that the Riverbend sets as a desirable precedent for this sub area 3. So specifically turning to the excessive height, this project is surrounded on 3 sides. So on the west with Ms. Chadbourne and her neighbors, to the north, there's a single story, I think it's a dentist office, but it's, you know, a similar sort of single family home style. And then across the street, of course, we mentioned the Geneva complex. You know, none of these are more than 1 or 1.5 stories. And then even to the south, where the density does sort of ratchet up as you move closer to downtown, some of those I think are getting up to the 40-foot limit, but none of them are actually 4 stories. Those are all three-story buildings. And again, when you talk about the pedestrian experience, it might not seem like a lot, but the difference between a three-story building and a four-story building is really quite imposing. And so this is where we get into, a little bit of a semantic game, because the staff response says several times, not just even these two times. On page 5, there's the quote: "The four-story elements are established on the side elevations. Side elevations generally have less impact on the pedestrian scale from the street." Well, this is the city's own rendering included within that response. And you can see if you're standing on the sidewalk just offset a little bit from the proposed development, it's very clear that this is 4 stories, and it goes all the way up to those patios on the 4th story. Similarly, that quote on page 7, I don't agree with that. The building presents itself as 3 stories facing Prince Street. I mean, maybe if you're walking along for the 10 steps that you're actually in front of the building, it would seem that way. Although, there's also that black part that comes off the top. But when you're on either side of it, it's very clear that this is a 4-story building. And the concern there, and again, this is going to the subjective criteria that this board is empowered to consider, but looking at the context of this site and really what this proposal is replacing, the excessive height is most concerning because of not only the pedestrian experience, but then what's happening with neighbors. And you have these balconies sort of reaching out over the surrounding 1-story homes. It's really going to change this area. And I'm sure the applicant is going to say that's sort of where things are moving south of this property. But, all of these homes to the north and the west, and then across the street at Geneva, have been long established. There's no suggestion that any of them are going to be changing anytime soon. And so I think when you all figure out, where is the appropriate place to transition into these old single-story, single-family homes into this much more intense development, I'd submit that it's just not appropriate to go all the way up to 40 stories. Even if it is allowed, that's the sort of discretionary review that this commission is charged with considering. And then part and parcel with the height is, of course, the density. And so we've already lost the trees there, and the proposal has that lawn going away. But if this SDP is reversed, then what will be allowed there will be a single family home. And so hopefully someone will be able to replace those trees and replace the landscaping. It won't be 50% of the site is impervious driveway, and the other 50% roughly is the building with a little postage stamp on the front and a little postage stamp on the back, just to check the box on the open space requirement. Also, with all these new residents moving into a historically single family area, you're going to have additional noise. It's also going to generate additional traffic. And then, as I mentioned toward the beginning, actually, the on-street parking is a real concern when you look at this only having 9 parking spots. I know that Prince Street is becoming more and more busy. It's become a big bike commuter corridor, and there's concerns about the safety associated with that. And, if the more difficult parking becomes, obviously that feeds into traffic issues. And so, again, technically, this scale might be allowed from a parking standpoint, but I would ask the commission to consider the actual specifics of this proposal and what it was before and what we're going to. So ultimately, we'd ask the commission to reverse staff. The site development plan, it violates the applicable zoning. It violates the downtown design guidelines. Again, those are sort of the black and white issues. But then even on the more subjective criteria, it's inconsistent with the comprehensive plan, and it's incompatible with surrounding uses. So I'm happy to answer questions now. I'd asked to reserve time for rebuttal, but I think that's up to the chair whether I get an additional time to speak, or if we just do sort of an open question opportunity at the end. But happy to answer questions at any time. And thank you all.
Okay, thank you. So questions for the appellant. What we'll do is we'll use the raise your hands on the computer. You go down press the participants, and then your name will come up. If you press the raise hand button there, I'll acknowledge you. You can ask your questions to the appellant. Do we have any questions for the appellant? I see none so far. Could we take the drawings off the screen, please?
Yes, thank you all.
Thank you. Okay. Anyone have any questions?
Vice Chair Schwartzbacher had raised her hand.
Ah, there it is. Okay, finally saw that. Go ahead, Robin.
I had a question concerning your thoughts on this particular building not meeting the housing for this area. I'm a little confused with the idea that you're right, this housing will not suit everybody. But is there any housing that would suit everybody? Because people are looking for different things. So it seems a little tight to be saying that this needs to satisfy everybody all the time. Could you maybe express a little bit more your thoughts on that in case I'm misunderstanding what you're saying?
Sure. I think, obviously we haven't had an opportunity to consider alternative proposals. We had reached out to the developer to maybe talk about different options and never heard back. And I know there was a public participation process that ultimately resulted in this design. But I think something that would be more equitable and open for all community members would be something that's 1 or 2 stories, or if you're going to go up to 4 stories, to include an elevator. As it is right now, it's going to be a very sort of narrow subset. It'll be significant, but not everyone will be able to live in this unit.
Okay, so you're explaining that how you have read this is that every building has to satisfy everybody all the time.
Well, I think that's what the code aspires to. Ultimately, it's up to this body to decide if that balance has been met here.
Thank you. I appreciate that.
Well, I had a question or just a comment for the appellant. You had mentioned that the only replacement, if this is denied, is a single story or 1 unit residential property. And I'd submit, get your opinion. This, as I read the zoning code, you could do a quite dense apartment building with a single entryway. Obviously, the vast front facade would be facing the street, parking somehow wedged in somehow, probably with a side driveway, and then you go. Most of the main level will be a parking garage. That's been done elsewhere in the downtown area, north of Main Street. So any comment about that? I mean, it doesn't necessarily have to be a single family resident. It can be an apartment complex.
Sure. All I was referring to there, I think it was in the staff report, the presumptive use here without an STP would be a single family home. So you're correct. There are other allowable uses for this site under the CA zoning. I haven't specifically studied how those uses would fit within a lot this small and what would be allowed. But, the question tonight is whether or not to approve this SDP. If it's ultimately reversed and this applicant wants to move forward with a new project, we would invite them to involve us in that process and to find something that would fit within this neighborhood.
I just want to clarify your contention. So this is a CA and R5 area, which allows for quite a bit of density. Who else has their hand up? Bruce? Then Craig, you're up next.
Thank you. A couple questions. The 2014 comprehensive plan goal 1.9 talks about strengthening downtown by increasing housing diversity and densities. Under the circumstances, help me understand why this would be objectionable given that particular goal. It seems like a single family home on this parcel would not meet that goal and would hypothetically be in violation of the comprehensive plan. And then I also wanted to ask, I guess, a question about the townhome definition, but let me stop there and invite you to respond.
Sure. So again, I think that somewhat goes back to the previous comment, which is that without an STP, a single family home would be allowed here. And so there wouldn't be any requirement to specifically show compliance with those goals under the comprehensive plan. If the applicant does want to move forward with a different STP, then again, we would invite them to work with us to figure out how more residents could be brought onto this site in a way that's appropriate for the context. And I'm happy to talk about the zoning, but I think that also, jumps back to the point that if it's an illegal land use, some of these discretionary factors actually don't matter.
I guess the other question, I mean, talking about townhomes, my understanding of the way this SDP is oriented is that it is technically apartments and it would be a for rent product as opposed to an ownership product. And it strikes me as sort of prima facie that a townhome is a property ownership product. So I guess I'm trying to figure out how to reconcile the concept that this is a townhome if we're talking about rental types of properties.
Sure. So, personally, I'm not aware of that distinction that townhomes are, owned as opposed to rented. But more to the point, I think you just look at the definition of what a townhouse is under the, applicable version of the code. And frankly, there isn't any discretion there. It doesn't talk about rentals or owners, and it doesn't talk about subdivided lots. It talks about horizontally stacked units with front and back access and shared party walls.
Well, let me reframe the question then. I mean, I guess to the extent that we've got properties that are essentially isn't the part about the fee simple property sort of just setting forth in the code what more or less is essentially common sense given a townhome product, that it would be fee simple and it would be on a subdivided lot, so forth and so on, which to me means that's not what these are.
Well, I mean, even if it were condos, which would have ownership, you wouldn't subdivide the lot. So I think the definition of townhome is whatever the city decided it was. And obviously the city has decided to change that, perhaps part and parcel with the prohibition on slot homes. But what we're left with is the definition that was in place in August 2019, which said that these are townhomes and that this lot is not big enough.
Okay. That's all I've got. Thank you.
Thank you.
Right.
Okay, well, thank you for that presentation, Mr. Silvestro. You mentioned before that there was some public engagement that led to this, and I recognize that you weren't involved with the appellant at that time. But I'm wondering if first of all, if you have knowledge whether the appellant did have an opportunity to provide input at that time, and your opinion on whether it was heard or addressed in any way during that time. I'm not familiar with the public engagement on this particular project.
Sure. So that was prior to my representation, and I have a bit of secondhand information, but maybe not anymore. Ms. Chadbourne was on the line. Now I'm actually not seeing her. So I guess I'm not going to be able to defer to her. My understanding, and I'm sure the applicant can correct me because I don't mean to misstate anything, is that there was at least one sort of neighborhood meeting, which I think is required under the SDP process. But from our perspective, there was no real back and forth. There was a suggestion of how this proposal was going to be. There was neighborhood reaction to that, which I don't think was too favorable. But ultimately, I'm not aware of anything that changed due to Ms. Chadbourne's concerns.
Excuse me, Chair, if I could. Ms. Chadbourne is on the line and does have her hand raised.
Go ahead.
Hi, this is Pam Chadbourne. Just a comment, the public engagement was the neighborhood meeting that the city encourages developers to hold. My comment to the developer was, I don't think this fits here. The developer included a write-up in his early responses and misrepresented what I said. That is not what he quoted me as saying. So just for the record, I'm going to say that his report on the neighborhood meeting about my comments is wrong. And my comment was, this project doesn't fit here.
Thank you. That's all I have.
All right. Any other, I don't see any other hands up. Anybody else want to ask questions? Seeing none, we'll go ahead and move on. Somebody had something?
I just said thanks again. Thank you.
Oh, thank you. Sorry about that. Okay, we'll go now go to the applicant presentation. Go ahead and state your name and your company and go ahead with your presentation.
Hi, my name is Jeff Klein. I'm with Klein Design Group, and I designed this building, and I will also be building the building as well. Some of the things in regards to whether this is a townhome and how that meets the criteria, I'm going to need some staff assistance on some of that interpretation. I wanted to, just thank you guys all for hearing me today and appreciate all the time the staff put into helping me over the last 17 months. We had quite a bit of design back and forth with the staff, and it took a long time, and I felt like their suggestions were good. And I met at every turn they asked me to change something. I changed it, and I felt like they did a very thorough job of interpreting their code, and it certainly was not a breeze at all. So I want to thank them. I guess I'll just kind of chime in on a few of the things that were brought up. In regards to the affordability part of this, we did originally start with 5 townhomes. We did up it to 6 just for the purpose of trying to bring a less expensive product to market, which would, I guess, based on your interpretation of what affordable is, that really was the goal, is to try to bring some of the value down of these per units. In regards to the public engagement meeting, yes, I did meet with the neighbors out there, and it was brought to my attention that they just felt like it just didn't belong. I didn't get into any specific details about what they didn't like. Was it the density? Was it the height? Was it the brick? Was it, the window color? There wasn't a lot of detail there. It was just, we don't want this. There was just one comment made to me that, I will fight this all the way to your bank account. It was just very, just more vague comments about just the overall development. Nothing that I could really go back and work with and try to redesign with. As far as the gateway to downtown Littleton, I did take a lot of consideration into the architecture of this building. I did a project on Nevada a couple years ago, and I remember going through that project with Anastasia, and I remember the comments that she gave me in regards to trying to look more residential with sloped roofs and materials that fit in more with the fabric of the neighborhood. And I really took that to heart with this design, trying to figure out how could I make something that speaks to today, not necessarily to the 1920s, but speaks to today, is art aesthetically pleasing, something that has the textures and the different variations of colors that meet the fabric of the neighborhood. And quite honestly, that's very difficult to do on that street, because you have a new development to the left, which is very industrial. You got an old development that was built in the 1970s to the right, which is all ranch brick. You got, I think it's an arts and crafts style home down the street on the corner that didn't even, I think was moved there. I heard it wasn't even originally there. And there's such a hodgepodge of architecture on that street. It was really kind of difficult to sit back and go, okay, what is the existing fabric of this neighborhood? And so maybe I took it upon myself to say, maybe it's, Jeff Klein's turn to, be the pioneer and try to come up with some way of creating a gateway or a sense of presence or welcoming to the city as you approach this building. I think we did put a lot of time and a lot of attention to detail with the staff on the design. And I feel overall is that aesthetically pleasing and it scales well. And we have to remember this is still CA zoning. It's not, where Pam lives on the street over to the west is not the CA zoning. That's zoned for her style of home. And the Prince Street was designed to be more higher density and taller structures and possibly apartments or condos or what have you. And I you could look at the extreme of what a condominium complex or apartment complex could look like there, and then compare that to what we've done. And I think what we've done is a lot more appealing. Maybe it doesn't look like a single family home, but it definitely could look a lot bigger and could be a lot more massive and could have a lot more units based on the current zoning. So I just wanted to reiterate that we went back and forth many times with staff, and I jumped through every hoop they told me to jump through. This whole process took us about 17 months. We paid all the fees. We had all the meetings, and I'm here to defend my design. And I feel like I think it would be a great asset to the community. So I don't know what the procedure is here as far as what staff's going to say. I don't know if I'll have a chance to rebuttal or not, but I'm really curious to see what staff's going to say here tonight too.
If you want rebuttal, you'll get it,
Okay.
as well as the appellant.
All right,
Okay.
thank you.
Is that it for your presentation?
Yes, that's it.
Thank you. Bruce, you had your hands up probably from the previous question period. Again, if you want to, do you want to ask questions now?
I'll hold off. You're right. I raised the hand and then forgot to lower it.
Okay. Well, press your hand button if you want to ask questions of the applicant. I see none so far.
Hey, Mark.
Yes.
I'll ask one. The same question, Jeff, to you that we asked Mr. Silvestro, or I asked Mr. Silvestro. That you called it a townhome. So, is it a townhome or what? Is it an apartment?
Well, I actually have a question for Anastasia, because the last project I did and this one, I think we are actually condos. We have to be set up as condos, which means that we will have an HOA and there won't be individual lot lines for these. So a lot of that had to do, well, actually, and I don't even know the full extent as to why they're making me do these as condos, but that's the technical term of it. So I would have to defer a little bit to Anastasia on a little bit of that question.
Okay.
Any other questions? Okay. Go scroll down here. I still don't see anything, so we'll go on. Thank you. Jeff, thank you very much.
You're welcome.
We're getting ready for the community development staff presentation. I'm going to give a little background before we turn it over to staff. I want to give a bit of background on if you get rid of that. Thank you. Okay. Give a little background on what's allowed in the CA district, which is this property is in, as well as the R5 area, which is generally west and southwest of this site. CA allows 5-to-1 floor area ratio, minimum lot size 5,500 square feet. Open space for residential is 20%. Maximum height is 40 feet. Setbacks is none. It allows for multifamily, 75 dwelling units per acre. It does have landscaping and lighting requirements included, as well as noise, obnoxious odors, etc. That's CA. So obviously CA is quite for Littleton, a dense area. The R5 area, you see you see development happening far beyond what originally was there, which is the bungalow homes. R5 allows a density of 43.6 units per acre. Lot size minimum 6,000 square feet. Minimum open space is 25%. Setbacks is front is 20, rear is 20 feet. Side is either 5 feet or 10 feet, depending on whether your side setback is north, south, east, or west. Maximum height is 30 feet in the R5. And by the way, both the CA area and CA area in this particular area, as well as the R5 in this particular area, is not part of the downtown historic district. So that's a little bit of background. I'd like to ask staff before they begin, let's get some dates pinned down here. The date the application was made, August 19th, 2019. Is that correct?
That is correct.
Okay. Yeah, I'd like the date that the moratorium was put in place for slot homes.
I am going to have to defer to Reed on that, but I am thinking it was January.
Okay.
It's definitely February.
February.
I would say it was February 4th.
February 4th. Okay. By the way, there's still the moratorium is still in place. So until the moratorium is lifted and we approve hopefully it's approved, the phase 2 of the ULUC, they will be abolished, right? But still, it's just a moratorium, correct?
The moratorium is still in effect right now. I would say this particular development, obviously, because it was filed in August of 2019, came in before that moratorium. The phase 1 and phase 2 amendments are also not applicable to this particular development as it came in prior to the adoption of that, as well as the comprehensive plan, which was not adopted until October of last year.
Okay. Fine, I agree. Last question is what was the date of the new comprehensive plan put in place?
October 6th of 2019.
October 6th, 2019. Thank you.
Yes.
Okay. With that little preface there, staff, go ahead with your presentation.
Excellent. So I'm Jennifer Henninger, Community Development Director of the City of Littleton, and I am the Community Development Director that you all have been referring to that has made the decision that is before you this evening. Carl Onsonger, who is also online here, is the case planner for this case and has been working closely with Mr. Klein as well as other departments within the city on this project. He is going to present the city's position and why we made the decision that we did this evening, but Carl and I will both be available for any questions that you all might have. So with that, I am going to turn it over to Carl.
Good evening, Planning Commission. Chair, thank you for this opportunity to present on behalf of the city the appeal on the 5423 South Prince Street site development plan. So this was approved by the Community Development Director on July 30th of 2020. The notice to neighbors was sent on August 5th, which triggered the 20-day appeal period. The appeal was submitted on August 25th, and then the applicant response was received on September 14th. There was also a additional information received by the appellant on September 9th. So to go through the site development plan, it is at 5423 South Prince Street, applied for on August 19th of 2019, and subject to the comprehensive plan at the time and also the Title 10 code at that time. It is in the CA zone district, and Chairman, you did a wonderful job reciting all of the applicable code under 10-18 of the city code. It is a 6-unit multifamily building, and I'll get into the technical details of townhome versus multifamily apartment a little bit later. It meets the 40-foot height requirement in the CA zone. As noted, there are 0 setbacks in the CA zone. The density would allow up to 13 units on this site, given the size of that site per that 75 dwelling units per acre. There's only 6. And it is in a slot home design, which was subsequently defined and then prohibited in the phase 1 code changes, but those do not apply because it came in well before those were ever envisioned. So the first time slot homes kind of came into the study session conversations with phase 1 were actually in January of 2020. To review just the facade, so the code defines primary facade, and the design standards define primary facade as, I had it up just a moment ago, the facade of a building oriented parallel to and facing the primary street. And so it has the front unit facing the street, which would be that primary facade, seen here on the right of the screen. And then there are 2 entrances with direct access to the street, which meets a additional design criteria in the downtown design standards. To address the some of the points raised, this goes with the applicant's supplemental letter laid out in on that September 9th letter. So not quite doesn't track exactly with their presentation tonight, but I will address as much as I can. So they referenced that the height of future buildings should respect the historic character. And then the comprehensive plan guideline or the comprehensive policy then goes on to say, retain the current maximum height restrictions in the downtown's underlying zone district. That was 40 feet or 3 stories at the time of the comprehensive plan, and that has since been changed to 40 feet, which this plan meets. There's no real talk in the code or any consideration for a limit on stories. And then with the architecture and materials, those really are addressed with the downtown design standards for matching those elements and scale. So there's also, as noted by the appellant, encourage accessible housing types for all income ranges and age. And staff would just reiterate that this goal speaks more broadly to housing policy for the city. And when from a staff perspective, when trying to administer a comprehensive plan, when we see these sort of policies, we rely on them when we can. One way that this might be able to meet that would be for the city to have some incentive for affordable housing or additional provisions for ADA access and things like that. But when applied to a 6-unit site, it's not really as applicable and hard to administer without being unreasonable or capricious in that regard. So the other aspect is that it's part of a gateway. So the gateways are really established at Prince and Santa Fe for the entrance to this. So per the downtown plan, it actually is outside of that. However, when you look at the existing scale of other buildings, as you make that approach into downtown along Prince, especially on this block, being at that 40-foot level actually matches some of that context. And then again, that there is the comprehensive plan that to strengthen the downtown by increasing housing diversity and densities to help enliven the streets and support the restaurants. So, it's a reiteration that the densities established in 10-218 for the downtown CA zone are appropriate. And, council had time to adjust those, and they did not. As far as the downtown design standards, as I noted, so the primary facade is parallel to the street. And again, the primary facade is defined as the facade of a building oriented parallel to and facing the primary street. There's been contention that this really should be defined as how many units or the majority of the units. unfortunately, the definition is silent as to that. So from this, the one unit facing Prince Street, which is the primary street, establishes that as the primary facade. As also noted in the illustration, it's, this is really for corner lot treatments to make sure that there's not overly angled facades, and that we're really getting the street fronting building faces. To the other, the property only has one block face, so 1.2.8 is met. To the contention of activation of the street, and there's multiple balconies and also entrances, and it's always a balance when activating streets of respecting that private residential character of the property, but also doing those so there's other amenity spaces like a bench added to further kind of activate that. There's other provisions for establishing the base, middle, and top, and establishing kind of smaller chunks for human scale. And especially when you look at kind of what establishes that, most predominantly, it's that for the first floor treatments that were added to the project, establishing that, which further mitigates, 40 feet. But looking at also the other context on that block, 40 feet, frankly, I don't think disrupts that pedestrian character and scale. And the other provisions under the design standards were reviewed pursuant to that design standard checklist and were deemed to be met. To the appellant's third point, to mitigate adverse effects, first of all, the minimum lot size is met. I think the contention, so per the definition at the time, and I think this stays even with the revision to that definition, this does not qualify as a townhome, primarily because of that front unit does not have direct access in front and back because it abuts the one behind it. And so, one provision would disqualify it from that. I think the other point to that is, a townhome subdivision, even if you meet that definition, is not required to suddenly, if you have, let's say this, was a row home in a horizontal, full block, there would be no requirement that they subdivide each of those lots. They could also simply condominiumize them. And that's as the applicant also pointed to, any lot that wants to have an option for ownership would go through a condo process if it does not meet that townhome definition. But otherwise, properties can maintain, as long as they meet the number of structures allowed on that lot, in a much larger lot configuration with only the structure itself, as long as it meets the minimum lot requirements. So to suddenly make people either condominiumize for sale units or anything else really traverses into regulating tenure, which would also be a dangerous place for a city to go constitutionally wise. It does not exceed the maximum density. And then also looking at the surrounding properties, especially for those on the western side. So those are the properties fronting Nevada. There's significant setbacks from the rear property lines, which would further mitigate any shadows from a 40-foot building. And the picture below also shows the building next door is at 40 feet, and that picture is taken about noon. So the shadows are there, but not terribly stark. Further, there's no criteria from the code that requires that mountain views are maintained. However, also from the depicted in the picture below, there are no mountain views from the site as it stands today. So that argument doesn't seem to move things forward. Continued, the site exceeds the minimum unobstructed open space established for the CA zone for residential properties with 23%, and then 17% of the lot is landscaped. Looking at the existing site, with regard, we do now have in the phase 2, or actually I think it's in the phase 2 code, provisions for tree canopy preservation, but that did not exist at this time, and the owner was able to remove those trees. It meets the minimum parking requirement for a multifamily home above with 6 units. And then the overflow parking, the concern for parking on the street at that site is largely mitigated by the proximity to free public parking at the city center building. So I also bike along Prince on a regular basis and haven't really noticed as much impact from other street parking from recent development as well, just as a side note. As far as the concern for privacy, there are minimal windows on the rear elevation and only 2 above the second story. And so, really those views, from those would be not as impacted. And then, from the balconies on the side, this is a urban area. And so having those is, something that is allowed. And given the other setbacks and kind of landscaping around in the area, other mature trees, it does not appear that those would rise to the level of a unmitigated impact as well. As far as noise and odor, I reviewed the location of trash services, making sure that, these things fit within the garages and whatnot. So there were exhibits that showed that, a car and a trash can and other things could be handled on that site. So those were considered by staff and deemed appropriate. And, just given the impacts, it's appropriate given the urban context as well. Were there to be any impacts, but frankly, I don't believe there would be. As far as the compatibility of architecture and colors, this is one of those times where architecture is a product of its time. It continues the flat roof and brick material from some surrounding development and per the design standards. And I think that's really the point of the design standards. It's to, allow for design flexibility while also establishing the parameters by which development needs to fit. And so, that's a gauge of whether or not it is ultimately architecturally compatible. I don't know if, the vernacular is, as the applicant has mentioned, is mixed. So I don't know if there's but anyways, I believe that that is met. And then, as noted, it presents as 3 stories from the street. This was mentioned in the staff report, and something. And just as far as the 4 stories, as a concern point, there is not a code provision against 4 stories at this time for the CA zone or in downtown. And then there are other examples of 4 stories in downtown that exist today. So, it is, a design that you see, certainly. And like I said, I think from the perspective of both establishing it being at 40 feet and that 3 stories kind of overrides the other concerns. At this time, I'm happy to take any questions. And, if there's any thoughts from staff as well, any points that I should reemphasize. But I will take questions from the commissioners happily at this time.
Any other staff want to make comments? Jennifer?
I think one thing that really is important to note is that this application was received prior to us having any discussions of a phase 1 or a phase 2 or even discussion on putting a ban on slot homes. And the way we worded our moratorium and how phase 1 and phase 2 would work is that any application that was in process, so it didn't matter where it was in the process, but if we had a formal application, would not be subject to phase 1, phase 2, or any moratoriums. So I think that is very important to note in the way I made the decision that staff did, and in your considerations as well.
Thank you. Is that the end of staff's presentation?
That is, yes.
Okay.
Yes.
Thank you. We'll go into questions of staff. Again, raise your hand on the button, and I'll acknowledge you. We could get rid of the pictures, although you might have to call them back up if commissioners have questions about individual slides. Anybody want to start? We have some. Okay, Sherry, we'll go ahead and start with you.
Okay, I really need clarification on the zoning itself, and which was pointed out initially by the appellate, but also, it sounds like our staff is interpreting the zoning code differently, or which applies to this project. So I'd like to have Steph's opinion / clarification on using 10.2.18 as the criteria E2, lot size 5,000 square feet total, versus 10.2.18 for F, which is for residential only developments. Minimum lot size per residential unit, 2,500 square feet per unit. So can you clarify how you selected or decided which of those two criteria to use in evaluating this project?
Absolutely. So
okay.
10.2.18E2 is for all residential lots in the CA zone. And so that is for, if that is a minimum established. So if you had a lot that was 4,000 square feet, that could not be developed as a residential lot if it was 4,000 square feet. Now, when 10.2.18F comes in to play, is only for those residential developments deemed to be a townhome, which is highlighted here, lot requirements for townhouses. So this is only for those which are townhouses. And I would note that this is a subdivision requirement. Were they to want to sell or to subdivide for the allowance of fee simple ownership for each townhome unit. However, there is not a requirement that they do that. So they could have a townhome, a building that meets the definition of townhome on a lot, as long as it's the minimum square footage of 5,500 square feet. They could have any number of those on a single lot as long as it meets the minimum lot requirements and not have to subdivide it. And so that's really where, and then were they to subdivide it, for the ownership, this one, their opportunity to subdivide would actually be a condo plat, which would be reviewed pursuant to the condo plat standards, which is different from the subdivision standards or lots.
Okay, thank you.
Bruce, you had your hand up.
Well, essentially, I think I was going to ask something pretty similar to what Sherry was asking. I guess, Carl, if you can maybe talk a little bit more, the appellant arguing that the zoning is, this SDP is violating the zoning, and I think we're hung up, or there's certainly, in my mind, additional clarification that could be warranted in terms of townhome versus condo versus so forth and so on. But maybe talk a little bit more about just your guys' assessment, if you will, as to why the zoning is honored as far as this SDP is concerned versus what the appellant's asserting.
Absolutely. So I would reiterate kind of for that definition of a townhome, it really, let me, this, here we go. So when looking at that front unit, so again, to read that definition of townhome, so the definition at the time was a single family dwelling unit with a private entrance, which is part of a structure whose dwelling units are attached horizontally in a linear arrangement and have totally exposed front and rear wall to be used for access, light, and ventilation. Units are separated. The last sentence doesn't really apply. And the key, and I think staff's view of this, is the totally exposed front and rear wall. And so the first two, really the first unit, disqualifies it from this definition because it doesn't have a totally exposed front and rear wall, because that rear wall abuts the adjacent unit. Whereas, yes, all the other ones would, and but for that, this would be considered a townhome, but because of that front one, it disqualifies it. Now, at the time of this application, there was also not a definition of apartment. And so based on that, when you have two land use categories for multifamily, one being apartment and one being a townhouse, well, if it doesn't meet the definition of a townhouse, but is still clearly a multifamily product, then it's an apartment and allowed in that. So it met the other minimum lot requirements for, above 5,500 square feet and the densities and all the other provisions of that zoning code. And so really the first step is, that's really where staff says it can't qualify as a townhome because it doesn't meet all of the provisions of that definition.
All right. Thank you. I appreciate that.
Is that it, Bruce?
Yes. Thank you very much.
Okay. Robin?
I have a point of clarification also on the townhome aspect of this, Carl. I'm looking at on your slide, it would be slide 4. And you're talking about the front and rear wall of this unit.
Mm-hmm.
When I look at it, you can see the front and the rear because the second unit in actually does not come out to that first unit. So maybe you could clarify what you're saying about how that second unit prevents that first unit. I don't see what you're saying because I see the front and the rear as being open.
Absolutely. So when, again, looking at that definition of townhouse, having a totally exposed front and rear wall to be used for access. That rear wall for that front unit, and I'll zoom in. So if this is the front wall, by extension, the opposite wall becomes your rear wall. And it does not have full access. It does not have lights. It doesn't have ventilation. It doesn't have any openings. And so that's what establishes and disqualifies the product as a whole from being a townhome, because that rear wall doesn't have any access like that.
All right, I do see what you're saying. I appreciate that. So it's the fact that the front door is on the east side of the building as opposed to being on the north or the south side that's dictating. Yeah, and then so hence the second unit having its front door also on the east side would designate the west side. to be its the front and the back. Okay, I appreciate that. Could you talk a little bit about the, you talked about the subdivision process on this, also not making it a townhome. Could you please restate that again?
Absolutely. So as it does not meet that subdivision process or that the minimum lot requirements for that. So, you know, were this to qualify as a townhome, you know, there is a process whereby they could draw lot lines going from the north lot line to the south, just as a hypothetical. Again, this is not allowed per the zoning and subdivision regulations, but were this to be allowed, you'd end up with just lot lines going from the north lot line to the south property line. And each of these would be owned separately with full ownership from, you know, the north all the way to the south. Through the condo process, they have to designate, you're basically just portioning off airspace. So, you know, the driveway, for example, would be common ownership through an HOA document. You need, you know, condo declarations and things like that. But then each unit, they basically would subdivide per se condo plat or condo map each unit to divide the airspace. So they wouldn't own all of the lot. You know, some of the lot would be owned in common ownership, which is really the difference between that option for a subdivision, a townhome subdivision versus a condo plat. The condo plat really would be for, you know, individual units, whereas the townhome would be for individual lots.
Okay, and an extension onto this, having the SPP, as the appellant noted, does say townhomes. Curious why that was never corrected, since it obviously doesn't meet this.
Absolutely, and I think this is something that we would review. Was noting before, just about every site development plan in the downtown area has tried to call themselves a townhome. You know, the Prince 10 townhomes, the Sycamore 8 townhomes, even though they don't meet that definition. And it's just honestly been more of a branding, you know, thing. And then just, you know, sometimes you end up with, it's more of a naming convention at that point, less of a guiding standard under which code provision they would fall under. But I think going forward as a best practice, we'll be likely revising that so that both clarifies the provisions for the applicant, but also which relevant code standards for the community as well, just to add more clarity into that process, because the branding has gotten in way of clarity, I would say.
Yes, that is accurate. So when you were talking with the applicant going through this process, did you guys call it a multifamily unit, or what did you actually call it between yourselves?
So we would call it a multifamily unit or apartments. I mean, really, when you look at the code path under which provisions it would park at, for instance, it parks at the multifamily definition for 4 or more units. And so that's how it's administered in other places as a multifamily. Some of those were subsequently clarified in those phase 1 code changes for clarifying when do you park with at 1.5 per unit and when you park at 2, and you know, some of those things, but those were not in place at the time of this application.
So another clarification point, when we're talking about, as the appellant pointed out, this unit is surrounded by 1 to 2 story homes, but yet in our code, what we look at is strictly the block face. So even though you have the homes behind it and you have the homes across the street from it, those are not part of the block face. So as we are looking at Prince Street, we're really just looking at that side of that west side of Prince Street for what our block face is.
As noted in the staff report, you know, start with the more the context that fits the closest proximity and then expand out from there. So the block face is generally the guiding principle when looking at the context, and also just establishing that they could build up to 40 feet per the code. So that's also part of that. The other components is the houses on the west side could develop to their maximum densities and at 30 feet. It's hard to play hypotheticals. And the last point being that, this lot could have developed as a 40-foot single family home per those code standards. Right. So the fact that it's developing, even less than the allowed densities, it could have developed in the same footprint as a single family home.
Right. The issue here being the sense that you have the R5 right next to the CA, and they're very different. They're very different zones and allow different things on them. And that causes the tension that we're seeing right now. I have one question, and this would be for our lawyer. So Reed, could you talk about the mitigating adverse impacts? When I look at the code on that specifically, it gives us 10 different things to look at for mitigating adverse impacts, which is different than some of the things that we are seeing from the appellant. And how are we to look at that? Are we supposed to just look at these 10 adverse effects for these impacts? Do we incorporate the ones the appellant has brought up that aren't specifically listed? Could you please explain that?
It is a great question. And taking a look at 7 is that criteria. Any significant adverse impacts resulting from the use shall be mitigated or eliminated to the extent reasonably feasible, including, and then it's that list of 10. I guess I wouldn't say that necessarily it means only those 10. So I know a couple of items were brought up in regard to mitigating or purported adverse effects in regard to privacy or anything else. So could those be considered? Yes, I don't think it was necessarily just supposed to be those 10.
Okay, so if I heard you right, because it was a little garbled.
Sorry.
That's okay. It's part of being Zoomed, right?
Way to go, Robin.
That the 10 listed here, yes, but we can also look at the ones that they brought up, even though they're not listed here. We can go out into the things like the privacy that they brought up and that sort of thing to also take a look at that, even though it's not necessarily listed here.
I think that's fair.
Thank you. I appreciate that.
And I would note in that, that the location of building structures and improvements, there are a number of easements also on this site. So along the drive aisle, there's a 20-foot sewer easement that also extends, I believe, 10 feet on the rear property line. And so that also influences the location of the building and the overall footprint allowed. And so, given there are site constraints that also factor into that and how much they could mitigate these things. And, from staff's perspective and looking at the surrounding context, the things that the appellant has brought up would fall under that kind of 10.737A location of building structures and improvements. And we believe that any negative impacts have been mitigated, especially given the design constraints on the site.
Just one more question. I'd like to look at the privacy aspect of here. Again, we're looking at a tension between these two different zones. And you now have a 4-story building overlooking a single family home. And we see the same thing that happened there in Littleton Village, where we've seen these larger buildings going up that tower over the smaller homes behind them. I hear about the couple of windows. My only thought is what was your thought about that balcony that's on that 4th story that just now totally looks down right into that backyard? it would alleviate, there's no privacy at that point when you have someone who can look down from 4 stories down into your backyard. Could you just talk to that for a moment, to how you guys kind of dealt with that?
Carl, do you want to take that one? Because you have the slide up.
Would have to unmute himself.
Carl, I think you're on mute if you were speaking.
I had a wonderful rebuttal or a wonderful response to that.
But y'all missed it.
Yeah, I know. Let me try and solve it. So we do look at that, and for instance, in the CA zone, there are 0 setbacks, and yet this property, due to the nature of those sewer easements, does in fact have some semblance of setback. And so this, per the zoning, could have gone all the way to that property line. And so seeing that removed slightly from that property line helps mitigate that. Further, just looking at, again, the surrounding properties do have deeper setbacks, from their rear lot llines, and just the size of, for instance, the one directly adjacent, has about an 18-foot barn, shed structure back there. So just looking again at the surrounding context of what are the actual impacts, those are there as well. And just again, to reiterate that, yes, the R5 and the CA zone are different in some regards, especially with the difference between 30 feet and 40 feet in their height allowance. But, they are both multifamily, or allow multifamily. And so, a lot of that is just the tension of that they have remained in this single family configuration for so long. And, we recognize that, but, it's also balancing that against what's allowed in the zoning code. So given the surrounding context, the privacy fences, the other accessory structures, we believe that those were mitigated to the extent feasible and reasonable.
The extent feasible, I mean, you're towering over that house, so even that 71 feet does not take away from the fact that someone on that balcony can easily see into it. But yet again, it's what's reasonable and feasible for what we're looking at. I appreciate that, Carl. Thanks. I have no more questions.
Can I add one more thing? And actually, Carl, can you bring up the Littleton Design Standards sub-area plan? Because another thing to note here is that in applying design standards, the property in question is in a different sub-area and subject to a different set of design standards than the surrounding properties that face Nevada. So I just need to bring that to attention too, that we are dealing with 2 different types of design standards.
Let me jump in and add one more thing as I can as the chair. The 2 single-family houses to the west of this property could one day be rather bulky structures, apartment buildings 30 feet high and 20 feet away from their east property line. So
that is correct.
Nothing is, frozen in time here. The properties to the west can change and are allowed to change, as well as the property to the north of this property in question that could also change. Who do you have up next? Robin, are you done?
Yes, I am.
Okay, thank you, Robin. Craig, you're up next. Jason, you're next.
Okay, well, thanks, Carl. I just have a few questions. One sort of a clarification on something I think I heard when you're describing the zoning, the CA zoning, with respect to the height limit of 40 feet. I thought you said something changed with respect to the number of stories that were allowed, but I don't think CA addresses number of stories. Is that correct?
So that was a change that happened in 2018, actually a few months before I started with the city. So for a time before now, it was the language read 40 feet or 3 stories.
Yeah.
And that was subsequently changed to now just 40 feet. I think the contention there is, well, what if you're 3 stories? how tall can you go? Could you have a 50-foot tall 3-story building because it's 40 feet or 3 stories? And so that's when council put the hard provision of just 40 feet.
Okay.
Wise move.
And that was 2018 that code change happened.
Okay. So at the time of the application, this language was in effect that it was just 40 feet maximum. Would you consider in your evaluation that this is a 4-story building? Oh, it wasn't quite clear because there's the rooftop decks and so on. Would this be considered a 3-story or 4-story as you see it?
So I think it is, clear that it would be a 4-story building. But again, just looking at, what presents itself to the street with the 3 windows, especially on that, kind of tower mimicking structure or part of that facade. It is 3 stories, but on that facade, but the building itself is in fact 4 stories. I wouldn't contend against that.
Okay, thank you. The only other question I have is if you go back to that appeal point number 3 slide that shows the plan view with the offsets, the adjacent, that one. I was just curious why you show the dimensions to the building structures when I guess I would see the impact of shade and scale as an effect on the whole property. The backyard, say they have a garden out there that all of a sudden's in shade. Do you take that into consideration, or should we be taking that into consideration? Or is it really defined as the impact on the adjacent structure? And I guess to the point that Mark made earlier that there could be a future building there that has a smaller setback, what is the actual impact on that adjacent property?
Understood. And, I think when looking at it, I think looking at, if a building was going to be in permanent shade because of a development, that would be something that we would look at. And I think that's, so you start to, walk through it in levels and gradients. And so, would this property put another property permanently in shade? No. And as far as, impact to the one on the north, as noted, that is currently a commercial use. And, when I've observed it, the blinds have been almost always drawn. And so it seems like they're trying to keep the sun out regardless. And future, that size of that lot, were to be redeveloped, they could design their structure and their things to also mitigate the size of the structure on the subject property. So then, when looking at, again, since it's not going to put the other structures on the rear lots, so the single family homes and do permanent shade, looking at, well, again, the one directly that shares the most of that lot line, does have that significant accessory structure there. And then just the space between that structure and the lot is, itself kind of unused space just from a Google Earth perspective and looking at that. So, just again, looking at, so if those I think factors along with the just setbacks because of the easement on the subject properties lot would also mitigate those. So, there would be some shade, but it wouldn't be, permanent all day long, and certainly not as much in the afternoon at all.
Okay, thank you. That's all I have.
Thank you, Craig. Jason, you're up, and Behzad, you're up next.
Thank you, Chair. Part of the opening portion of the appellant's presentation talked about the townhome issue, which we discussed a while back, and then also the downtown design guidelines, specifically 1.1.2 and 1.1.4, which hinge on the primary facade of the structure. And I'd appreciate it if you could just reiterate the definition of primary facade, because in the downtown design guidelines, I believe you said it has a very specific meaning.
Correct. So up on the screen, I have put up the definition of primary facade, and that is the facade of a building oriented parallel to and facing the primary street.
So it's about this facing the primary street versus, say, the number of entrances to a building.
Correct.
Thank you. That's my question.
Faison?
Yeah, I have a couple of questions. Number one, when the application on August 19, 2019 filed, was the development classified as townhomes or condominiums?
So condominiums only come into play if it's a condo map, and that was not applied for. So it was considered a multifamily apartment, actually, because it did not meet the definition of townhome.
Okay, so I heard something, maybe I heard wrong, that the developer referred to this as townhomes. Is that correct? Or where did townhomes designation came? Because until the way I understand, there's a legal definition for townhomes versus condominiums, and there's a legal consideration and basically legal definition for condo versus townhomes. And those are definitely differentiate between the two type of ownership. Was that defined and communicated to developer by the city staff?
So when reviewing it against the code, it was reviewed not as a townhome. The designation or naming of it up till now in our operating standards, in our code, we do not have naming conventions for site development plans when they come in. If it was truly offensive, we'd probably have them change it. But a number of these are just for kind of keeping track of which site development plan you're reviewing at any given time. And so from that perspective, even though the site development plan mentions townhomes, staff did not review it and directed the applicant. Basically, we reviewed it as under the multifamily apartment designation, which again wasn't defined at the time. So it's that was the code path that they were reviewed under, and everything else was kind of just mislabeled branding from staff's perspective. But like I said, we will do a better job going forward of making sure that that's clear which product is actually being reviewed as in the code. So apologies for the misunderstandings and how that kind of plays out in this regard, but it was never really reviewed as a townhome.
So this development definitely going to be a condominium with the homeowner association or condo association.
That is yet to be determined.
Yeah, there's no pending applications at this time for that. So it could remain as a uncondo mapped lot and simply under one ownership for all the units, or they could go through a condo map process and sell different ownerships. From the city's perspective, to try and guide them or to regulate that and say you have to do one versus the other would be to regulate tenure, which I think would get us into some pretty murky constitutional waters very quickly.
Okay, thank you. That was my question.
Well, I have a couple of questions and a comment. I could go down bullet by bullet point and get a yes or no, but I'll just ask you outright. Does this development meet all the standards for the CA district?
It does.
Current standards in our old zoning code, which is still in effect until we come up with a new unified land use code about a year from now. So
that is correct.
So it does meet all the standards of the CA area. It does meet all the standards for parking, which is 1.5 cars per unit average.
Correct.
Correct. Okay. The fourth story, just a clarification, the fourth story, there's not a plan of the fourth story in the presentation. Is it mostly deck or with just a covered stairwell and then a door to the deck, or is it got a covering over it? Is it open to the sky? Describe the fourth floor if you would.
Absolutely. I'm bringing up, since I stopped sharing my screen right as soon as I needed it. I am bringing up the fourth story or the elevations. So I'll zoom in and clean up.
You have a plan?
Space. I do.
The floor plan? Is that what you're asking, Mark?
The fourth story plan, yes.
So I don't believe we have a fourth story plan.
Okay.
But I do have the elevations.
Okay, elevations.
So this is the south elevation, and so those decks looking north, or actually south in this view, are set back a little bit. And then looking at the north elevation. So this would be the elevation that most directly looks over the single family in the R5 zone, because the ones on the north really look at that other 40-foot building on the south adjacent lot. So the north elevation, so looking northward, none of the balconies or stories are above 2 feet here.
Mm-hmm.
So again, I think that's another mitigating factor as far as privacy and those sort of things. The ones that have the most view potentially of those, the R5 zone, are set lower.
Could you scroll up, please? It's still not clear. I'll ask again. The decks, the fourth story decks that you can see there, are they? Looks like a lot of it is covered by a roof. Is that correct?
That is correct. Yes.
Okay, that's all I need to know. Yeah, obviously, in the past, there's been several slot homes built in Littleton, all allowed with our existing zoning code, long before the moratorium. If you went by a redefinition, as the appellant wants, we'd have many slot homes that were incorrectly designated as apartment and multiplex apartments versus townhomes. So I guess my editorial comment would be, what are we going to do? Tear them all down because of a misjudgment of the definition? It seems like your definition is clear to me, is what is a townhome and what is a multiplex unit. The only other comment I had is the zoning code, our very old zoning code, is silent on many issues, but it is the law that we follow. Not following it is recipe for chaos. It is silent on privacy, shading, and views, for example. Is that correct?
That is correct.
Okay. Other municipalities, for instance, Denver has regulations for second or third story balconies in the rear 35% of a residential lot. They also have regulations on in the rear 35% of the lot, only 1 story habitable space can be built. Littleton has none of that. Littleton zoning code is silent on the issues.
Currently, yes.
Yeah, thank you. Hands are still up. Is Reed, did you have your hand up? Did you want to add something?
Yeah, I've had it up and down several times, not knowing if I wanted to further complicate things. But the whole definition of townhomes has come up a few times, and I was hoping to have staff and the applicant and everyone else kind of engage in that discussion. But I felt kind of a need to jump in terms of a couple things. So the first thing I would say, from a technical standpoint, a legal standpoint, the whole idea of the zoning district standards, that would be number 4 and the appellant's argument, that was never preserved on appeal. So when I say that, I say the deadline for Ms. Chadbourne to submit her criteria that was in question, that was never one that came through on the date of the application. So while we've kind of been dealing with the issue, is it a townhome, is it not a townhome, why isn't it a townhome? It's probably not relevant in the grand scheme of things because I don't believe it was properly preserved on appeal. With that said, and Mr. Rudnicki, you're quite right in flouting our awesome land use code that we have to work with. When we look at multifamily dwelling, as this one has purportedly been treated by staff, the definition of that is any building structurally divided into 2 or more separate dwelling units, including rooming/boarding houses, apartments, condominiums, and tourist homes. So it obviously fits within that definition. It's divided into 2 or more units, doesn't fit the townhome according to staff. And so it falls within that multifamily dwelling unit definition. I think that's all I have to say for now, but didn't know if we were going to get too deep in the weeds regarding this specific definition, but I just kind of wanted to chime in with my legal thoughts on it. So thank you.
One more point, my reason for bringing up the other slot homes that have been built throughout, mostly on I think all of them on the north side of Main Street, is the interpretation. I think we've set a precedence here. So that to me, and so we're not just creating a new definition for this particular project, but we've been using the definition for the previous 6 or 7 slot home projects that have gone in. Any other?
We've had no definition for condominiums or a definition for apartments in our code, so it's obviously been open for interpretation over the years and room for a lot of improvement.
There are a lot of holes in our existing zoning code.
And that's what phase 1 and phase 2 we're trying to start addressing.
Can't happen soon enough. Any other questions?
I have one, Chair.
Dan, go ahead.
Curious, Reed, this is for you. Under 10.7.4 appeals, just curious if a homeowner has the opportunity to appeal again. Do you have just one chance and that's it, or how does that work?
It was generally within 20 days from the community development directors signing off on this. So the time for more appeals is done.
Thank you.
Anyone else? Okay, hands are still up, but I guess they haven't been silenced yet. Okay, we're going to get into some rebuttals probably. That could take some time. We're going to take a 5-minute break here. 5 minutes exactly. We'll start up again and we'll allow rebuttals from the appellant and any last comments from the applicant, and we'll go to motions. So 5-minute break. Welcome back. Hopefully we're all refreshed. Grab something to eat. We'll continue with rebuttals. We'll start with, let's do it in reverse order here. We'll start with the applicant. Do you have anything to add?
I'm the applicant, sorry.
Applicant and what's the other word we're using? Appellant, yes, you're the applicant.
The only thing I kind of wanted to show you guys, I have the model here behind me I'm going to grab real quick. I just wanted to point out, Carl was very thorough. This was some of these little bump outs that I had on the side on the third level. These were the master bedrooms, and I felt like architecturally these were, really nice, kind of breaking up things. And he said that this was kind of in the very last kind of reiteration. He said that we can't have these little bump outs because the sewer easement has to go vertical a certain distance, and so we had to pull those back in, and that was kind of a major change for us because it really affected the floor plans inside. But I just wanted to point that out because he was, obviously we were far enough along. I built a model. I felt like we were good, but he was very, very concerned about, just making sure we got everything correct. And one other thing that he pointed out in the back was we only had to go back 7 feet for our rear setback here. But he requested we go back 10 feet because he wanted to make sure that backhoes and things could get back in here to service a sewer line that's back here. So the sewer easement was only 7 feet. He made me go 10 feet. Obviously, I didn't, think that was great for, the floor plans to lose 3 feet across all these units. But I just wanted to point out how thorough Carl was, and there was many back and forths and design changes throughout this whole process. And you guys have a very good staff.
Is that it?
That's it.
Thank you. Appellant. Comments?
Yes, thank you very much. And thank you to staff and thank you to the commission for the time tonight. We really appreciate getting to have a dialogue with you all and answer your questions. So I think just ticking through the 3 big points and responding to some of what we heard on the primary facade issue, the zoning, and then some of these more subjective criteria regarding the design standards and the comprehensive plan. Starting with the primary facade, the issue there is really best encapsulated by, may I share my screen, Mr. Chairman? Mr. Chair.
Yes, go ahead and share your screen, Jim.
I think I'm used to being in court, so you get yelled at if you don't ask for permission. But just really focusing in on what the city staff itself has put in the rubric, the matrix, if you will, for approval under the downtown design guidelines. 1.1.4 talks about the fact that the majority of the building's primary facade has to be oriented parallel to the street. And the argument that we've really heard is completely circular. They're saying that the primary facade is necessarily the one that's facing the street, but that doesn't make any sense when you look at 1.1.4, which is saying the majority of the primary facade. The primary facade is the facade facing the street, then that's always going to be met. That's, taking any meaning out of that requirement. So when we talk about the majority of the primary facade, that's where it's asking the commission, the staff first, and now the commission to think about what is trying to be achieved through this requirement. And by putting 2/3 of the units facing into a fence, basically, I mean, what is that doing to activate the street? What is that doing to activate the pedestrian experience? And we talk about the height, and I'll get to the subjective factors in a moment, but just thinking about the height again, it's not just the height, but it's the height given the width of the building that we're dealing with. And so when you walk by in front of this sidewalk, it's going to be a monolith that towers over you. When you look at the side, I mean, we just saw the model. It's really a land barge where it's so much deeper and taller than it is wide. It's not going to be an experience where the primary facade is on the street. I mean, all of the activation is going to be on this north side facing right into, what is a single family home being used as a dental office. Turning to the waiver issue on zoning, I want to speak directly to the city attorney's point. There's nothing in that appeal provision 10-7-4 that specifically says that it's a use it or lose it, that you can't raise any new issues after submitting your initial notice of appeal, that you can't argue issues in this setting, which we've done tonight. So I think that that's an unreasonably punitive interpretation. It's sort of closing the door to citizens that want to participate in this process and bring issues to this board that apparently staff had not considered or thought through, because, we'll get to the specifics in a moment, but I think there is sort of a blinding gap in the way that this townhouse regulation has apparently been interpreted in the past. But on the waiver issue specifically, Ms. Chadbourne's appeal raised the comprehensive plan. Ms. Chadbourne's appeal raised the downtown design guidelines. Both of those say right at the front, whatever use you're going to put in here has to comply with zoning. So the zoning challenge is subsumed in the things that she explicitly put in her notice of appeal. And I would really caution the board not to make that procedural issue, critical to overturning a citizen's right to ask for this sort of hearing. And to be heard by the city officials. When we talk about zoning specifically and the definition of townhouse, I think it's pretty clear from the board that this is confusing stuff. I know there are some comments that this is something you all are hoping to clean up as you move forward. Mr. Chairman, you mentioned the fact that other arguably townhouses have been approved when they probably shouldn't have been. I can't speak to those specifically because I, didn't represent those parties. I don't know the specifics of those. But you said, what are we going to do? Tear them all down? That's not how land use law works. If they were approved in error, then they're grandfathered in, and that's a completely separate situation. But to say that those have precedential effect when I don't think any of those were ever appealed to this board, we're appeal number 1 on the year in September. I don't think you can just look to those and say you're bound by that precedent. I think what you have to do is look to the specifics of the land use code. And when you look to the specifics of the land use code, it clearly says that townhomes are when you put these homes lined up horizontally, one after the other. And, I think folks have struggled with the semantics of this a little bit because when we talk about this type of building, we all naturally just call it a townhouse. And that's certainly what the developer did here. Staff's acknowledged that they didn't push back on that because it was seen as sort of a branding thing or a marketing thing. But, branding or marketing, when you talk about statutory interpretation, that's plain meaning. That's just confirming what everybody knows is true. And so even when we look at, staff's creative interpretation to say, well, the front 2 units aren't really townhouses because they face east as opposed to all the others that go north-south. Even if you were to agree with some creative lawyering there, that would still leave you with 4 townhouse units. The definition of townhouse in 2019 isn't about the total structure. It's about, sorry, that's the old one or the new one. It's about down here at the bottom, it's about each individual unit. So even if you agree with the argument that 2 out of 6 of these aren't technically townhomes because they vent off to the east, what you're left with is 4 townhouses. 4 townhouses that each have a minimum requirement of 2,500 square feet. That would require a 10,000 square foot lot, which of course you don't have. You have a 7,400 square foot lot here. So even under sort of that very careful and creative argument, you still have an issue here where we're talking about townhouses. Similarly, when you talk about the subdivision requirement, there's nothing in here that says anything about a subdivision requirement or moving forward to have these be rentals or to get a condo plan in place or to subdivide them into townhomes. And I want to go back to this provision of the code, which is expressly talking about the minimum minimum lot size for each unit, And what you see, bear with me for just a moment, is that this section 10.2.18F it isn't in the subdivision rules and it isn't in the condo rules. It's under the approved land use within the CA area for residential only developments east of Santa Fe. That's exactly what we're talking about here. So to say that this doesn't apply, frankly, I just can't understand that argument, because there hasn't been any move to subdivide this property and there hasn't been any need to do that, because that I think staff's acknowledged that's something that happens later on. But when you just look at whether or not you give something a thumbs up or thumbs down approval under the zoning, you have to go to this 10-2-18 section, and under subsection F, it's very clear, irrespective of whether these are apartments or condos or one person owns 6 units or whether they're subdivided, the definition of townhouse that we see in 2019 expressly applies to this development. So, again, I just urge the board to be cautious here, because this is an error of law. And so as we look at, what the next steps are here in this process, and this is a black and white one. This isn't a question of discretion or, one side had a better argument. The code says what the code says. And again, I just go back to marketing or branding. The plain meaning of the code is what everybody knows. It's what the applicant himself knew what he was doing, or maybe he didn't. But what he did was, this is from the SDP itself that you all are voting in a moment to either approve or deny. It specifically says SDP 19-0008. This is a project for townhomes, 6 single-family attached residential townhomes in one building, 6 units with all attached garages. These are townhomes. So then turning finally to the more subjective criteria, again, what we heard in staff's presentation was about how this meets the minimum requirements, or it doesn't exceed the maximum requirements. When you flip back to the requirements for approval of an SDP, it's not about just doing the least amount possible or making it work. It's not about squeezing in the most units or the most floor area ratio or whatever you can get into what's, obviously a very challenging lot. But I think the point about it being a challenging lot, there's no alley access here. It's only 0.17 acres. It's very small. That really speaks to the fact that the proposal needs to be more sensitive to the surrounding context. I mean, you heard about the fact that there are sewer easements and things like that. I don't think that weighs in favor of maximizing every square inch of the project. I think that requires a developer to work with the community, which didn't happen here, to pare back and to add in landscaping, not to just hit the bare minimum 20% of open space. And so, again, unlike the black and white sort of legal issues for this commission to consider, the approval criteria ask you to look at the comprehensive plan and ask you to look at the design guidelines, not because they obviously tell you, what boxes need to be checked, but because they trust this commission to balance these competing factors and to ultimately, consider and approve only those uses which are appropriate within the specific context. So again, I thank you all. I'd urge you to vote to reverse the SDP approval. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Well, we've come to motion time. I'll entertain a motion from someone. Bruce, are usually a motion man. Put you on the spot there. Or we'll get Craig to do it.
Well, I guess you want a motion before Q&A?
Yes. That's how we normally operate.
Yeah, I suppose.
Not agreeing with me. We go to a motion, then we'll have a discussion. Then we'll do any amendments that come up, and then we'll vote on the amendments, and then we'll go back to the main motion.
All right, I move to uphold the administrative approval of case number SDP 19-0008, hereby confirming that the development is substantially consistent with the comprehensive plan in place at the time the application was made, is substantially compliant with the design standards in place at the time the application was made, reasonably mitigates significant adverse impacts and effects to the surrounding properties resulting from the location of the proposed building, and features architecture that is reasonably complementary and compatible with existing development on surrounding properties.
We have a second?
Second.
Who was that?
Jason.
Is that you, Jason? I'm sorry, I had to.
Yes.
Okay, thank you. Rather than raise hands, we'll go up and down the rows here. Behzad, comments? Or we could, wait, let's hold on a second. Let's do amendments first. Are there any amendments proposed here to the main motion?
So I would just jump in and say that they would be conditions.
Oh, excuse me.
It would probably work the same way as an amendment, but
okay,
just so that technically we're sticking with the terms of our code.
Thank you. Anybody want to propose a condition onto the main motion? Seeing none, unless I'm blind here, there's no condition. So discussion. Behzad, we'll start with you.
I do not have any discussion. I concur with Bruce's assessment, and I agree that this needs to be approved.
Bruce?
Reed, I need you to address Mr. Silvestro's comment concerning the zoning issue as a matter of law. Can you help us understand? I assume that sets up a potential appeal of this thing going to the court system because, well, you tell me.
Theoretically, what Mr. Silvestro and his client have available to them is an appeal in front of district court. 106A4 is what I think he should have, but our code would say 106A2. And I believe what Mr. Silvestro was trying to convey is that this is one of the issues that is not as subjective as other areas of our code when we started talking about the zoning. Either you allow this use or you don't allow this use. It's one or the other. It's black or white in his mind. I would tend to agree to a certain extent. Obviously, there are very definitions within our code that allow for different results to be had. But when we're talking about black and white, I guess I would say, yeah, and black and white would be one of the areas within our code where it actually is pretty specific and it's pretty impressive for our code. And it's within that major site development plan appeal. And it says, the appeal shall specifically indicate which approval criteria are the basis for the appeal. And upon an appeal being filed, a party other than the applicant shall have 30 calendar days to respond to that appeal. That seems very clear to me that the whole idea of the zoning, that specific use, the arguments regarding whether or not the townhome should be there or not, that should have been part of the original appeal. And part of that is a due process. And that due process is on the part of the applicant also to be able to prepare a response. So I'm not sure, Commissioner Stallman, if that answers your question, but I think what Mr. Silvestro was trying to say that it's a black and white, it's a yes or no issue.
Okay, thank you.
Done, Bruce?
I am.
Okay, Jason. Dan, you're up next.
Right. I seconded the motion, and based on the testimony tonight and the record that was presented to us, support the motion. Certainly acknowledge that this form of housing, regardless of what you call it, is no longer permitted in Littleton. However, we need to play by the rules that were in place at the time of the application, which did allow this sort of thing.
Yeah, I'm agreeing with Commissioner Reynolds, and based on the written material provided and what has been presented this evening, I believe the city staff has thoroughly reviewed the subject site development plan pursuant to the approval criteria established in Title 10, Chapter 7-3 of the Littleton City Code. I take no exception to the city staff's approval of the subject site development plan and recommend upholding the administrative approval.
Craig, you're up next. Sherry, you'll be up next. Go ahead, Craig.
Me? Okay. Yeah, I don't love the development proposal. I think it sort of violates the intent of what we've seen since the moratorium went into effect, and basically what people want to see in this part of downtown. But I agree that it sort of threads the needle in terms of timing and meeting the details of what we understand to be the requirements of the CA district, and appreciate staff working closely with the developer here to make it fit within that lot. So I do not see a reason to reverse the decision on the SDP. So.
Sherry?
While I appreciate all the work that the owner has put into this and trying to meet all the standards, I don't feel that all the criteria was met. I think the primary facade issue is a valid issue, that only 2 units face the main street, whereas most of the doors are facing the back of the building or the north side of the building. I don't think that meets I don't think it meets the zoning regs. 10.2.8 is concerning to me. I think it's very unclear, and I don't feel like this project meets the intent. I think that it falls under that category of that it's a 2,500 square foot per unit versus 5,000 total. So I don't see that. I also don't feel that the adverse impacts have been addressed thoroughly. I think for the most part they had. The balcony, the privacy issues to me are probably the biggest concerns.
That it? Thank you. Robin?
Thank you.
Oh, Bruce, you had something else, but you'll wait.
I'll wait.
We'll let Robin go second to last. Go ahead, Bruce.
I was just gonna basically offer up my 2 cents worth, and I agree with Jason and Dan and Craig. I think that essentially staff's done a very credible job working with the applicant in this case to try to make a project work that fits with the CA zone and that meets the intent, good faith intent of the comprehensive plan that was in force at the time, in terms of trying to effectuate or activate more housing and greater density in this particular area in support of downtown and Main Street. And yeah, I just don't feel good about moving goalposts after the fact. And I think, these things, were set up to give people guidance as to how to proceed with projects. And that was done here, and to, call time out at this stage and say, well, we think other things apply now, so you don't get to do what you thought you could do then, just doesn't strike me as being fair either. So I'm going to obviously support it.
Robin.
I appreciate both the appellant and the staff and the applicant's explanations. I agree with the threading the needle here, listening to both sides with the valid points that they are each bringing up. But I do believe that staff has met the requirements, and I do support this.
Okay, thank you. Well, my points are that reiterate that it does meet all the zoning code, our C5, CA zoning code requirements. And that to me is overriding. The comprehensive plan is very general by nature and by design. It's not site specific, so requiring that every unit or every project has affordable housing or handicap accessibility is incorrect here. It's a standard for the city, not site specific. The comp plan uses the word encouraging quite a bit. Again, it's not mandatory. They use the word encourage. And there's nothing in the zoning code that specifically talks about views, privacy, shading, nor does the zoning code require that these items be addressed. Noise and odors are regulated elsewhere in the code. What's assuming here, and I've seen this so many times on the Planning Commission, is it's only the latest development that creates the noise, the traffic, the danger of the children, etc., not the existing structures in the neighborhood. That to me is not fair. Every development and on every block does add to noise and pollution and danger to children and parking. As for the architecture, comment was made that this is out of context with the neighborhood. I find that very subjective. There's so many types of buildings being put up legally. Every bungalow in the R5 area could be replaced eventually with an apartment building 30 feet high and quite a few, 13 to 26 units. And so this is a very fluctuating neighborhood. Lastly, I did not bring up the fact that there are slot homes previously built that they were illegal. That was rhetorical comment, and also rhetorical that they should be all torn down. I agree with the city's contention that they say that it's not townhomes, but it's a multiplex unit, and the precedence was set not just by the decision of this site, but by the other properties, other slot properties that were built. So I'll be in support of upholding the city's decision. Any other comments? We will go to a vote. Let's see. Up is keeping the city's decision. Vote down, obviously, against. Can we have a show of thumbs, please?
The vote is 6 in favor, with Commissioner Almond voting no. The motion carries.
Okay, thank you. And thank you for applicant and appellate for your presentations. It was eye-opening. It'll also help us down the road when we're getting going on the rest of the city's ULAC. What else is next here? We have comments from staff. Any staff comments before we adjourn?
Yes, just a few. One is just a reminder that the phase 2 will be having its public hearing next Tuesday, October 6th. On that, so tune into that. We had a great study session, lots of great comments on that and some changes. I do believe there will be some amendments that council will be offering up. Reed, do you have anything you want to add to that?
No, I'm gonna, it's a secret for now. Thank you.
Yep, that is fine. And then we are seeing an uptick in our pre-applications that we have. Mike, do you want to add anything on that?
No, there's been quite a few more pre-applications, as Jennifer said, but I would like to just say thank you to the commission and the appellant and the applicant. That was a great discussion tonight.
It was. Okay. Anything else, Jennifer?
No, not at this time.
I just have one. Commissioners, any comments, any questions of staff?
I have a question.
Sure.
Does it look like there's anything on the agenda for our next meeting? I think that's October 12th.
Right now, no.
Okay.
Which will bring up my point is when do we get started with the remaining three blocks for the ULUC?
Right. So right now we are scheduled to pick up the ULUC again with an Envision Studio for the mixed use and corridor block on Monday, November 9th. And that right now is scheduled from 4 to 6 is the time slot for that. So we'll probably, after next Tuesday, we'll get more information pushed out about that Envision Studio. And unfortunately, at this point, it will be online. It will be a Zoom format of sorts, whether it be WebEx or Zoom. I think that is yet to be determined, but it will be unfortunately online.
Bruce, you had something to say?
Yeah, Jennifer or Mike, just curious, there'd been some chatter a while ago about the Enser property. Is there any up-to-date information you can share with us, or is it still sort of under wraps?
So we have been working very closely with the applicant and have been waiting a traffic study and a revised PD. We anticipate receiving those here in the next 2 weeks. And we are really striving to get this project, the proposal for the PD amendment before you in December is what we are hoping to target. Mike, do you have anything to add to that?
Yes, we did receive an application for the southern side of the property, 161 units on a portion of the property. And we are about to process that in the near future. I think it still has to be paid for, but it is a site development plan, a major site development plan, and a subdivision plat.
It's not a rezone, is it?
Oh, excuse me?
Is it a rezone?
No, we don't have an application for a rezone currently. They have confined the application to the PDR, or Plan Development Residential portion of the approved plan. So unless that is appealed, it would not go before a public hearing.
So there's a chance we will not see it at all, unless there's appeal, like the one we had tonight.
There's a chance, correct.
And just to clarify on that property, so the Enser property itself had actually been divided up into 2 different properties and 2 different ownerships. So the one that I was referring to that's going through the PD amendment process is the northern 35 acres, I believe it is. Yeah, the northern 35 acres, and they are asking for some additional things that are not currently allowed in the 1980-ish Santa Fe River Park PD. That is what entitles the land right now. And then what Mike was referring to is a portion of the 100 acres to the south. So that's kind of basically goes all the way down to the equestrian, the veterinary clinic. And the northern line is a little bit above the ditch, correct, Mike?
Correct. The 2 properties are abut each other, approximately, north of the ditch.
Yeah.
Okay, thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Anyone else? If not, we will call for an adjournment at 9:24 here. Thank you very much, commissioners. Very good meeting, very enlightening, very interesting. Thank you.
Yes, thank you very much for your time on this, everybody.
Thank you, staff and
Thanks to-
commissioners. Thank you.
Thanks to staff as well. Great
Yeah.
effort.
Yep.
That's what we're here for.
It was a lot of work preparing for this. Yes.
Yeah,
Yes, thank you to Carl.
there you go.
Carl.
Thanks, Carl.
Carl snuck out early. Thank you. There it is.
Thank you, everyone.